Charlemagne, thank you so much for joining me for Lamster. And the topic of this stream, well, we're just going to be talking about things that we love to rant about, technology, and in particular complexity. I think there was a recent back and forth that you had. Do you want to explain what the impetus of that was?
Yeah, so this a couple days ago, Joel Davis posted on his Telegram a post about complexity and management, and how as complexity in societies grow, the complexity of management must grow, and the complexity of the systems they use basically necessarily grows. And I saw Academic Agent responded to this, and then Joel responded back, and I saw that Keith Woods also had a post on it, which was quite good. I haven't actually read AA's post because I want to keep my own critique fresh, and not influenced by others. But I guess one of the main things I found interesting about this was sort of the idea that complexity is good. He was basically
Hmm.
saying complexity is good because complexity allows you to have more function, um, and you need more complexity to manage your systems better. And I think coming from an engineering perspective, the dreaded computer programmer, I think we have a very unique and very useful perspective on the type of political things we discuss. Obviously, someone like Joel Davis, I know for a fact that he's more well read than me on philosophy, especially, but I'm sure history as well. That being said, I have a decade of experience professionally engineering complex systems, and certainly not trivial ones either, ones that process billions of dollars worth of transactions over the course of my career. And this kind of perspective, I think, needs to be taken seriously. Not just the computer programmer perspective, but any engineer in general.
Hmm.
You could think of it like structural engineer. What do they call the people who urban planners? I think that could be a
Uh-huh.
type of engineer. So I think we've talked about programmers before, but in sort of a negative way. But when you actually engineer systems that are complex, and all systems are the same in some respects, when you actually make them, you get a different perspective than purely thinking about them theoretically or philosophically, which is important to do. Theory is important to do, but theory from an engineering perspective is more or less built on practicalities rather than the other way around. Whereas in politics, we often sort of derive our actions purely from theory, which isn't really how good engineering is done.
Hmm.
Let me shut my door really quick.
Sure.
Yeah.
Go ahead. Yeah. So there's this two kinds of knowledge, I guess. One of which is intellectual knowledge that you could read a book and gain, but there's a different type of knowledge, which is the knowledge of experience. And you don't really know something or someone until you've had that direct one-on-one interaction and stared it in the face. And I think maybe I made a mistake opening the stream saying, "Oh, we're going to talk about programming," but a bunch of people probably said this is going to be boring and closed out. What we are people who've had a direct face-to-face stare down with complexity and really know it, not just know it from having read it. In fact, I'd go so far as to say many of my lecturers at university who had a completely academic career talked nonsense because they'd read about complexity, but they didn't know about complexity. And actually, I had to unlearn lots of the things that I'd been taught at university, which were completely back to front on this topic.
Yeah, I noticed one thing Joel actually linked in his post about complexity and managerialism is he linked a mathematical formula about complexity, and frankly, I just don't care about any of that stuff. The formulas like this are important for calculating things like big O, which is an algorithm to determine the performance of an algorithm is going to be. So I'm not dismissing mathematical models of complexity, but again, when it comes down to actually implementing things, engineers who have done that, whether or not you're engineering a structure, plumbing, electricity, you know that a simple solution actually often gets you more than a complex one. One of the things I actually talk about specifically in the blog post I'm writing, and this will be a paid post as well for any subscribers out there on my Substack, is how one of the key functions that complexity sort of eliminates or makes much harder is the idea of extensibility. A complex system is much more difficult to extend or iterate on than a simple one. And that is a very important um, function to have in whatever system you build, especially in the realm of statecraft, right? Which is kind of what Joel was actually talking about explicitly there. Human
Mm.
systems, in particular, um, need to be able to change and grow and integrate new features into them, deal with new geopolitical realities, whatever. So it can't be understated the degree to which complexity makes managing a system actually much more difficult and can actually eliminate your ability to improve its functionality.
There's this famous idea that probably even non-engineers have come across, where the story of the guy who asked to be paid in rice, what sounds like a small fee, a single grain of rice on the first square of a chessboard, two grains of rice on the second, four on the third, etc. And yeah, just fill up the chessboard according to this straightforward algorithm, and that'll be how much rice I need. And when you actually do the calculation, it ends up being like more grains of rice than atoms in the universe. And there's an aspect of complexity that works a little bit like this, isn't there? So, or another good example of this is the way that handshakes would scale. So suppose you have a meeting with three people in it. How many handshakes need to happen for everybody to have shaken everybody else's hands? Well, the first person shakes hands with the two other people, and then there's only one extra handshake that needs to occur. So you've got three handshakes with three people. If you introduce one more person, that person has to shake hands with all the three previous people. So you've doubled the amount of handshakes just by increasing the number of people by 25%. The reason this is connected to complexity is because people have the impression that if you double the number of features, for example, and double the number of things that a system can do, you will get twice as many bugs. It will take you twice as long to finish. It'll take you twice as many people to do it, and all of those assumptions are just mind-blowingly wrong. Generally, a small increase in complexity leads to this exponential growth in the difficulty of managing the system.
Yeah, and that's actually, I think Joel Davis had referenced the formula that describes that exactly. But you sort of framed it the other way, whereas increasing the functions gets you more complexity, whereas his framing is like you add complexity to get more functions. And I think this sort of, yeah, you see how it's backwards right there.
Yes.
And that's a very non-engineering understanding of how complexity actually works in a system. The other thing I wanted to criticize, which I haven't gotten to writing about yet, so I'm still thinking about this, but is sort of the concept of managing, right? Like I've noticed nationalists do this a lot, especially the managerial oriented ones, where it's the classic problem of the manager coming in with a technical solution. So they're like, okay, I want to be economically competitive in petroleum, so we need price controls on the petroleum, and we need this much manufacturing, we need this much fracking, whatever, we need this much refining, we need this much import and export. That's the absolutely worst way possible to manage an engineering problem, which is all an economic system is, right? The way you manage it is to state your product design or your goals, right? So your goal isn't to have price controls. Your goal is to be economically competitive in
Hmm.
petroleum, and then you leave it to your engineers to actually figure out what the best way to do that is. This is the problem with a lot of socialist thinking, I would say, in general, is that they come in with both the goal and the solution. And if you work in software at all, which I'm sure many people do, I know you have, this is a classic problem where your managers get out of hand and start actually designing the solutions rather than requesting a solution.
Hmm.
So there's really two. Yeah, I can't disagree with with this idea of managerialism and complexity enough the way Joel was framing it. So this is really important for people to understand correctly, to understand where the problems come in a practical sense, right? Like one of the things in my blog post I'm doing as well is I'm not talking about capitalism or socialism or anything like that. I'm purely approaching the ideas he posted from an engineering perspective that has nothing to do with nationalism or economics or this or that, right? And again, this is just sort of this is an area of expertise that I actually have in a very concrete sense, and I feel like it's important to talk about these things because so much of what we talk about is purely theoretical. Because a lot of us are young and we don't actually have a whole lot of experience in the political field, right? Most of us are
Hmm.
coming from these other sides, like a lot of us are computer programmers, and we're trying to understand politics, and we only really or economics, and we only really understand it from theoretical levels. But there are times like now where our actual backgrounds, be they like small business backgrounds or engineering backgrounds, they can actually help us understand how politics works. Because again, what I've learned is that all systems are sort of fundamentally the same in the sense that they
Hmm.
follow the same rules to some extent. Not like laws of physics that are inviolable, but like general principles. Again, whether or not it's a computer program is irrelevant.
There's a really fascinating concept that I only came across recently, which is that the the structure of the team that is building a system or building some software or whatever it is tends to be mirrored in what they produce. And there's some interesting examples of this. So I'm trying to think of one which might be tangible for our non-technical viewers, because I don't want to go too far into the weeds of geekery. But so okay, if you look at the okay in say in Windows, you've got different ways of adjusting the volume of your computer. There's like you can go into the control panel and there's a widget in there. There's a thing on the taskbar. I think in the new version of Windows, there's a second way of getting to it through the taskbar. Each of those has appeared, if you go back historically through the development of Windows, from a different group of people who worked either in parallel at the same time or at different points in time. So you can there's this odd synergy between what's being produced and the process by which it's been created. So if you have a well, I was fascinated by this idea, and I'm wondering now whether it does apply outside of programming. There must be a way in which the the complexity of the organization of a group also tends to produce these complex results. An unmanageable giant team, a committee, right, produces generally unmanageable, terrible milk toast results in whatever they touch. Does any of that spark ideas, or am I off on a irrelevant tangent?
Yeah, I'm thinking about my experience. I think the composition of the team mapping onto the type of system they design.
I mean,
I
I'll
don't know
give a
this. I'm trying to think of some examples because I can think of some, but it's hard to say. It's really hard to say whether or not the result of the design was due to the composition of the team or not? Like, how do you say it's caused
Well,
by this
yeah, okay. Well,
layout?
I'll give you a little bit more rationalization for why I think this ends up happening. So when you have, if you imagine an org chart and you've got in a simple organization two teams under a shared manager of some sort, the bandwidth of communication within each team is very high, and there's this friction for the teams to talk to each other. So you end up having
Uh,
the thing that's being built by each team is cohesive, efficient, and bears a single identity. But there's inevitably, in all kinds of ways, the two things that the teams are building talking to each other. By structuring your organization in this way, you are saying that there's certain architectural decisions that you think are not correct because by definition you can't build them because you just don't have the bandwidth of communication between the people in different teams that would make it possible to build that solution. Does that make
okay,
sense?
well, yeah, I mean, you basically described down to every single detail there a sort of conflict or problem that's happening on my team right
Huh.
now, where we actually do have software that there's software that's owned by us that communicates to other software that's owned by other teams, all within the same
Hmm.
company, and they're very I guess protective of their code. Like, it's even though we should just be allowed to go and architect solutions sort of in that domain, we're sort of not allowed to, and the teams sort of have trouble communicating with each other because there's this managerial layer, and the managers are very, or at least some of them are protective of who's allowed to touch things that their team normally works on, and they want to keep their product domain solely within their team, and you end up with
Mm.
two sets of software that are based on entirely different technologies, and
Yes.
perform
Yes.
their own functions very well, but when you put them together you end up with things that are entirely different, and they tend to communicate in weird ways that sort of end up necessarily breaking patterns, so they're not really coherent. um,
Mm.
I could also
May,
say I can think of previous examples where you have like an individual contributor essentially design like a whole system, and he's like genius tier, but basically you end up with this thing that only he can understand, and it's sort of impossible for anyone else to it's highly personalized, right? So a team of one produces a highly personalized solution as opposed to something that can be easily understood by multiple people. So yeah, I think your premise here, at least in the software industry, is basically spot on, and I can't imagine how this would not apply to any other given area. I mean, I think what we're talking about now describes some of the schizophrenia in the American government, where it seems to
right.
be pursuing multiple different policies, multiple different foreign policies, in regards
Mm.
to the current war, right? And I think that's because you have these different large apparatuses managed by different leadership, and they don't have a coherent way of implementing similar solutions, and don't even necessarily agree on the same solutions, which is a problem with managers at the same level, basically.
I thought of there's a couple of ways that this might be helpful for people listening to understand for more generally how we structure our communities and the significance of that as a sort of a side learning point here. Imagine we decided we were going to try to theorize and market that theorization over the next year, right? And we decided to build two key communities that were going to focus on those two aims. So we for example, we could make Telegram groups and Discord groups and Twitter Spaces that tended to fall into one of these two camps. Just the decision to organize our activities in that way would inevitably produce some results, such as the marketing efforts having less input from the theory. It would be very generic things like new discoveries made by the theoreticians would not be likely to be reflected at least not quickly and richly, in the external facing communications. And in reverse, the people doing the theorizing would have no idea of what kinds of things, what kinds of ideas might be valuable for outward facing communication, because they're in their headspace, and all of their constantly, all the conversations that they're having most of the time are blue sky thinking. So that's an example of how we can apply this idea critically towards the way that we structure our communities. And we should think seriously about, is it damaging to have these it's not necessarily a bad thing, because at some point you can't have everybody in one bucket working together.
Yeah.
But you can't escape the practical effects of these decisions organizationally affecting your output.
Yeah, you went exactly where my mind was going, given that we just discussed how, these different teams construct different solutions to their problems, even though they're part of the same organization. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think most people who have worked in engineering have recognized that working on small teams with a lot of technical independence is actually the best way to get things done. And it's not actually that big of a deal if the same organization deploys vastly different solutions to the various products or tasks or problems it's trying to solve. As long as the problems are solved effectively within each given domain, you don't actually need everything to be very homogenized. And this is a problem of centralized control mechanisms in particular, and managerialism in particular, when they go too far in terms of dictating how like the entire organization operates. That's actually not helpful. And I think this is something managers tend to want to do, especially at the highest levels, is sort of define these sort of global standards for everyone to follow. And you need to have some basic principles that you agree on, but that can very easily go too far. And this is something Joel talked about as well. Like you never see something like powerful states that are decentralized. I think it's not entirely that's definitely not how companies are organized. I think the best organization structure in an effective organization is not decentralized for sure, but it's not centralized either. It's more distributed, and there has to be a centralized leadership on top of that. But you want to distribute actually as much as possible. Centralization is something to be very skeptical of. I wouldn't say resist it. Complexity is always something to fight against. We never want more complexity where we don't need it. Centralization, not necessarily. There has to be some degree of centralization, but it needs to be done very carefully. And I think the managerial ideology that a lot of nationalists seem to be adopting, I think goes way too far in this direction. It's going to cause us serious problems, like any socialist economy has. That's not to say they can't succeed, right? Of course, you can have a very complex piece of software or system that works, and you can have a very centralized system that works. The question is there some other solution that could have worked better? And the answer is basically always yes, whenever something is over managed.
I think there's something here that should give us some encouragement. So I take a slightly circuitous route here, but Facebook currently has 70,000 employees. So some of these Silicon Valley companies feel like unassailable behemoths that can just achieve incredible things by their sheer numbers. But I want to challenge that notion, because on a technical level, what Facebook does, they produce a fairly small number of products, each of which I think could be achieved up to 95% of their features with a team of like under 20 people. And how has it happened that it's ballooned to this giant size without producing a similar number of a similar number of features? Sorry, how has it ballooned to this size without producing an improved output. Like this is kind of a thing that people scratch their heads around. There's different ways of approaching this, but or a similar question: how come a movie studio can produce a terrible film despite investing millions of pounds into the effort, and yet you can have somebody produce a genuine, valuable work of art that is cherished and loved by people, despite doing it very cheaply. And I think part of the mindset that you have to put yourself in is, can all work be effectively parallelized? These terms might be difficult for people who aren't involved in engineering to understand. So just to flesh that out a little bit and explain, there's a certain thread of activities that are required to essentially be done by one person from start to finish. You can imagine doing a Gantt chart, right? This activity can't begin until that one, which can't begin until that one. And in some of these activities, there's no effective way to spread them out. So this just puts an inherent limit on what large teams can accomplish, because there's only some of the activities that can be spread out, and ultimately the quality of the final product comes down to how well an individual did on key decision making along the way. All of that ramble to come back around and say that there are things that our let's say, for the sake of simplicity, adversary cannot do any better despite how much money and resources they have. And this, I think, should give us encouragement that a small, passionate team can do the seemingly impossible.
Yeah. Well, part of an answer to one of the questions you proposed there is, why does Facebook suck so much? And it's because these companies basically become bureaucracies that manage their product suite rather than the traditional capitalist corporations you might think of them as. That's why they have so many employees and seem to get so little done, in relation to how many people they have as compared to smaller organizations. It's the problem of these massive bureaucracies simply being too slow and bloated, just like governments become, to actually execute on anything very quickly. The other thing is, you mentioned the idea of the decisions of the individual. Too often we do tend to think of these large, you know, organizations. We talk about a lot of them. I don't know, pick one like the IMF or something like that, or the World Economic Forum, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
World Health Organization, United Nations. A lot of the key decisions that actually get you somewhere are executed by individuals. On my team right now, part of the problem we're having that I referenced earlier is this desire for, because managers want to be involved in solutions, they try to get as many people, especially from their team, involved in the solution, which actually ends up bogging it down. It's usually better to have as few people as possible who are the most competent making the key decisions rather than having, some bureaucracy making the decisions. I think we're sort of, the entire world at this point is entirely bureaucratized and obsessed with having all decisions run through bureaucracy, which is actually one of the worst ways to actually make decisions. And I mean, there's nowhere that this is better exemplified than in the field of warfare, right? Like you can't have a bureaucracy of generals making decisions on the battlefield. It would be an absolute disaster, and is a
Hmm.
disaster. Take a look at I think the German army in particular in both world wars suffered from this, like both on the Kaiserschlacht, and then also on the Eastern Front. Constantly shifting objectives from the bureaucracy back home rather than allowing the decisions to be made by the what you could call the engineers of war, right? Who were in the position to actually make the correct decision. So
Hmm.
that's just an example I thought of off the top of my head there of
I,
what we've been talking about in practice.
I always thought it was sort of odd and quaint that the president of the United States is called the commander in chief. Like, surely, surely that's just stupid to have one person who's in charge of all of the domestic affairs and the military and the internet. Just share it out. But now I kind of see it the other way around. That actually, if the president really was the commander in an active, involved way, rather than ceding decisions in any way, it would be a more dynamic, powerful military force, and it would end up making better decisions rather than worse decisions. So, like an individual at the top of an organization is is essential. You need a head.
Yeah, and this is something that, again, to use the example of war, like towards the end of the First World War, right? You have American troops arriving in Europe, and you have, the British actually, in large part, taking the brunt of the attack from the Kaiserschlacht, and the Entente are like, what do we do here? And the decision was made basically to put all of the Entente forces under the command of Marshal Foch on the French side, right? Or is it Foch? I think it's Foch. Um, and that again, that's giving all the decision making power to one person. And then again, you see this during the Second World War with Eisenhower, right? Like these bureaucracies, sometimes, especially when it's life or death, right, realize that it's actually better to just have one executive in charge of decision making. And of course, this is why I'm a monarchist as well. Unfortunately, with the president, right, like the United States president isn't actually in charge of everything,
Mm.
which is why why our previous president couldn't really get anything done to some extent.
We talk about the idea of the decentralized um, decision-making apparatus. So like Moldbug's term, the cathedral, and that being a strength, that it's this cabal of hidden figures who are not directly interacting and meeting to make decisions, but there's more a natural flow of incentives that produces these results. And now, I think if that is in fact what's happening, that's a weakness. That if such an arrangement of power, hidden power that had to operate in this collective, collaborative way, were to face a strong leader who could command in the open and demand respect from everybody under him in the hierarchy, it would substantially outweigh the benefits of central command and control would actually outweigh a military disadvantage.
Mm. I was just thinking about one of the things that I'm trying to. I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but this kind of ties into what you just said. Like on my team, the technical lead, he will basically sort of aggressively say no to the managers or tell them why they're wrong, right? And this is an important thing for engineers to do. And in relation
Mm.
to the cathedral, right, like it functions based on these incentives. Well, the the actual operators, the engineers who put plants into action, aren't really incentivized to sort of step on the manager's toes, even though they sort of ought to be, in order to do their job correctly, because the managers are the ruling class, right? And of course, we live in a very soft and lame society where you're not allowed to say mean sounding things to people, right? And of course, this is how,
Mm.
to tie it back into what you were saying, this is how like the cathedral works as well, where you definitely do have these incentives where the people actually executing decisions, even if they know it's a bad decision, might not even want to say anything about it because it puts them at an individual risk. So there's definitely sort of a systemic incentives in the cathedral that do exist. I'm absolutely sure of that. Even though we have some problems with the concept in the way Moldbug puts it forward, as if everything is sort of emergent behavior. But there are definitely incentives against sort of fixing anything, because that actually involves taking on responsibility. One thing bureaucracy allows you to do, which individuals tend to see as an advantage, even though it isn't, is to sort of avoid responsibility, right? Like, part of the reason I see a lot of engineers sort of avoid, sort of not fight the bureaucracy of the managers, is because by letting the managers make all the decisions for them, they avoid individual responsibility for anything that goes wrong. Ultimately, that doesn't work out in your favor as an individual, and it doesn't even work out in the favor of the whole organization, right? But organizations tend to lean this way. They especially seem to lean this way when it's so difficult to criticize anyone without them getting mad and possibly getting you in trouble or even losing your job or something. And of course, this will happen in the government or ruling class apparatus as well.
Just to drive the point home about the ineffectiveness of trying to run, as an example, a military through a committee. Think about D-Day. Why was it called D-Day? Because there was a specific day on which it was required to coordinate everybody to move to the same place at the same time. Now imagine theoretically you had a committee who were split, and half wanted to land the troops in one place and half wanted to land them somewhere else. Or maybe it's split even further, and some say let's land on Tuesday and some say let's wait till next Thursday. Eventually, in what could have been a hammer blow becomes a distributed, split up, ineffective, divided attack that just flops and fails and does nothing. So I think that's a really clear example of practically how centralized decision making leads to centralized action, leads to results.
Yeah, centralized decision making is essential at certain times at the highest level of an organization. So that's where Eisenhower as supreme commander comes in. It couldn't have been done any other way. Of course, what you don't want is the highest level person in charge sort of micromanaging everything on the board, right? Which is something that Eisenhower didn't do, but it is something that middle managers will tend to do, right? I think usually the people at the highest levels tend to recognize. I think that's how they get there, right? They tend to recognize that that pattern of management ultimately harms their organization. But the people in the middle who have some level of command, but are still quite removed from the ground level, and might not even have the expertise of the operators at that ground level, or even slightly above ground level, they will tend to do this, where they will try to make decisions that they don't really have any business making. So that's something managers do in all organizations, and I've always, anytime it happens, it usually harms the velocity of the organization. It doesn't necessarily stop things from getting done ultimately, but it slows down the rate at which you can achieve things. And in a competitive environment like international statecraft, you don't want to be at a velocity disadvantage as compared to your competitors, especially in the accelerated world we live in.
Another interesting observation from the world of software is that, so people are probably vaguely aware of the concept that you write software in a programming language, and there's lots of programming languages. There's just so many that have been written over the years. Some of them have been successful and stuck around, and almost all of the languages which have succeeded have what's known in the colloquial terms as a benevolent dictator for life, as in the person who originally made the language calls all the shots. And I think the fact that it's called benevolent dictator is the generally hippie-ish and liberal programmers being a bit embarrassed about the fact that this state of affairs exists, and it's slightly tongue in cheek, but it also describes a deep reality, which is there's one person who rules to some degree with an iron fist, and also even the way that they apply that has an effect on the quality of the output. So a language like C++, the benevolent dictator in that case is a guy called Bjarne Stroustrup, and he favors committee thinking for various ideological reasons. He thinks it's great that there's this group, this panel, which is set up to make decisions about the language. And most people would agree that C++ is a very is a very responsible choice for certain contexts. Like it's a good language in certain respects, but it's immensely ugly, and I think you can't decouple there again the decision making apparatus from the product that it produces. So I thought that was another interesting. I think it's fun to pull these ideas that are niche programming things and try and bring them to a wider audience for
That's really
their
interesting.
learnings.
I didn't know that history about C++, but I do really dislike C++ because it basically has every possible pattern of, you know, software design shoved into it in a very
Yes.
inelegant way. So
Uh
you can
huh.
kind of
Uh
do
huh.
everything, but it doesn't really fit together in any coherent way, and it doesn't look pretty. I'm trying to not trivialize that because code, like readability, I guess understandability is a more generalized term, just talking about systems. Understandability and coherence, things being samey, right, makes them easier to understand from an outside perspective. And C++ has so many different patterns built into it that different C++ programs end up being very schizophrenic. Like one program won't look like another, whereas if you take a lot of more modern languages, they'll any given program will tend to look like another in a very
Mm.
general way if the developers following the correct idioms. But C++ is not like that at all. So I could see why the design by committee would have resulted in all the things I hate about C++.
Yeah. So the design of the language Python, as a kind of counterexample, is the Python community describes there being a Pythonic way of tackling problems, which at first seems bizarre. Surely you just, if you're making a language, you should just give me the tools to express my inner creative individual way of solving problems. But the fact that people within the community not only use the language to accomplish something functional, but also express themselves in a way that reflects the guy who made the language, it is a way in which the person in charge has more control over what the people using his language do. And it comes out with all these advantages where people can pick up a piece of Python code if it's written in this Pythonic way, and understand it much quicker than they would have done otherwise. And you get fewer disagreements on, there's these PEP. I think there's like PEP 1, PEP 2, PEP 3, and so on that describe this is the approved way that you should approach this topic, and by just expanding the remit of this one individual, so that he has kind of greater expression through the people using his tool, you end up with a better result in in all these difficult to explain ways. It produces more more effective engineering.
Yeah, this might tie into how actual spoken languages sort of affect the way you um, solve problems, or I guess not solve problems, but just think. Right, the patterns of a computer language affect how you think about the problems you're solving for sure. And I think that can just be generalized to spoken language. I mean, imagine if imagine if spoken language was like this top-down phenomena that was
Mm.
built by committee rather than essentially by the practical engineering of it, right? Like people will literally just engineer words that are suited to their particular circumstance, and that's kind of how like slang develops, basically.
Hmm.
Um, I think that probably loosely relates. It's not a perfect analogy, but it sort of loosely relates to what we're talking about with computer languages and like why certain decisions make sense to have happen at the level where the problem is actually being solved, right? Like you would never have some committee like assign new slang words to Zoomers or something, right? Like that's just obviously insane. And then there are analogies. There are analogies to actual system engineering with that example, where like you would never have a manager like telling you what to name your variables or something like that. Um,
Mm. I just see all these ways in which you have to. I, the difference between me when I first graduated, at that point I had a certain set of views that I also see as similar to people graduating now. So it's not just a change over time. This is like effects of being green, effects of being naive and wet behind the ears, versus how I now see the world of software and so on, and quite a lot of them relate to the fact that I originally thought that freedom was really important, and now I see that there's other things that are much more valuable, and it plays out in all kinds of interesting ways. Like, should everybody on the team have the freedom to choose their own tooling? Tooling is like the so an example of tooling might be the editor that you use or the plugins that are in that editor, or you have a system that does tests on your code, or I'm trying to explain it in an accessible way. But if you decide on your project, you're going to support everybody's tooling, toolchain, whatever. So somebody comes in with a new, radically different way of developing, we're going to put effort into supporting them. Yes, okay, you've made all the developers feel good, but you've also radically increased the cost of your product because again, you've increased the complexity. Now your code base not only has to do the functional requirements that you were given by your client, but now you also have to have a code base that caters to the whims of this team. So there's a sense in which by your team bowing and conforming to a general design, you could think of other examples like somebody joins the team and then wants to fight everybody about line lengths or tabs versus spaces or sort of stuff like this. And everybody who's already on the team is like, we've got features to do. we don't want to have this holy war. But it's a classic thing, I think, for a graduate to be so opinionated and
ah,
to
mhm.
yeah. So does that resonate with you?
Yeah, two things you said there do. I mean, definitely the sort of first part you discussed. When you get out of college, you sort of realize that you don't know anything. I mean, most of what you learn, you're basically set up to learn in university, and most of what you actually know is from doing the engineering, right? Which is sort of the main point,
Yeah.
is that a lot of all we have is, or in some sense, all we really have in our movement is just this theoretical knowledge of how politics works, and we could look back at historical examples, but like we don't actually have the practical experience doing of engineering political systems. We do have a lot of people who have generalizable engineering experience, though, which is people like us. And that actually is, as I said at the beginning, very significant and not something to just be tossed aside because it's like a different field or something. Because this 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 understanding of how problems are actually solved and how complex systems are actually built well. This is really important to anything we try to do in politics. And for everyone, I read a lot of books as well. Um, but we have to understand that just doing the reading and understanding the theory, like that's you're kind of barely getting from 0 to 1 there, right? Like that's your university education, but you still don't really know how to do anything until you actually start engineering. And as far
Mm,
as I know, basically no one in our sphere is actually doing what you call political engineering, because that's just not where we're at yet. But we're trying to get there someday, right? And that's why this conversation is important. The second thing, um, well, I shouldn't say this conversation, but talking about this
the
topic, right? Yeah.
yeah,
I don't mean to ascribe ourselves some particular import.
that's why this conversation is
Yeah,
so important.
but it is subscribe to Lambda.
So, yeah,
Um,
follow Charlie on Substack.
but the other thing is, yeah, I think deliverables solves the problem that you referenced earlier, right? So on my team, we have a lot of individual tooling. We tend to converge on the same tools just because that makes it easier for us to talk to each other. But I think the thing is, as long as you can produce the thing you're supposed to as an individual, as a team, it kind of doesn't really matter what tooling you use. You don't get to request paid tooling for whatever whims you might have, right? But as long as you
Mm,
can work within the same patterns that the team does, if you're using like different brand text editors or whatever, that's kind of irrelevant, right? So there's
yes,
levels of
yeah,
where the tooling matters. Does it affect your
right.
deliverable, and does it affect your ability to socialize basically with other people? And as long as you can
Mm,
get what you need to do done, use whatever tools you want. That's an area where you don't want centralized control. That's really
sure.
annoying when you have centralized
Yes.
control over code editors. Right?
Yeah. Yes. I think that's. Yeah, I 100% agree. I guess I'd put that in the category of micromanaging, which you mentioned before is always a terrible mistake. So yeah, I probably need to process this a little bit more, because now I feel like there's a contradiction between the two things I was saying. Members of the team have to fall in line. Maybe this is the question, right? If there is if there's conflict where different members of the team making different individual decisions actually affects each other, then you need to potentially just, whoever's in charge, make a decision and enforce it. And sorry if you don't like the decision, but we're going that route. But where each individual can make a decision about their approach that doesn't affect other people on the team, then they should 100% be empowered to do so. So, like a text editor, there's loads of different text editors that people could use that do the job at hand, and there's no value in enforcing top down that everybody uses the same text editor. But I could imagine somebody saying, well, my text editor has this really awesome feature, and it only works if everybody puts these particular comments in the code. So now I want everybody on the team to like document their code using these special characters that helps my text editor out. And that's where it begins to become either that's a decision that's made for everybody on the team and they're all going to make use of that, or we're not going to do it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah. I mean,
Okay. Let's talk about utopianism. So I think very frequently about the story of the Tower of Babel,
mhm.
and where it applies to our modern society. And I think we see this in the software world quite often. People get sucked into this approach is the utopia. And if only I could convince everybody. So functional programming is one that there was a trap that I fell into once upon a time, right? If only everybody would write their code in this particular way, we would eliminate almost all the bugs. And but fundamentally, any belief like that cannot be correct. It's utopian thinking. Can you think of examples of utopian thinking, either inside software or maybe in our community more widely?
I mean, it definitely exists on the political level. A lot of political systems are utopian in this way, where they sort of claim to be the best possible mode of organization, when really the best mode of organization really depends on the circumstance that your group is actually functioning in, or your subgroup. Again, components of the American government or your government, for example, they're not composed identically, right? Like you don't have a legislature and executive and judiciary in every single sub organization. The military is going to function very differently. The government will use private contractors for certain things. Something like the State Department is going to be very different from NASA, right?
Mm.
So you don't. This applies to software engineering as well, where your teams at your software company are going to look different to teams at other companies, and even teams internally within the company, depending on the particular task they're doing, whether or not it's like managing your infrastructure or your databases, or actually writing the code or something like that. I think, so obviously the clear cut example here is something like communism, right? Where you have this sort of overriding structure of organization across the entire society, when it definitely doesn't make sense to apply that at every single level, and through the same bureaucratic mechanisms, ascribing the same solutions to every minute part, all the way to the bottom level of individual factory workers or something like that, right? So yeah,
Mm.
I think utopianism is certainly, in the way you've defined it there, is definitely something that we see in our sphere, and of course in engineering as well.
Another thing that scales in an exponential way with complexity is the surface area for attack. So I'm thinking of
Hmm.
security here. If you if you continue to build more and more into a system, you are creating exponentially many ways that system can fall apart. Um, I see this again as a a vulnerability of the current system that as as perhaps as dissidents we are critical of, that I think that elites don't understand. This is another, maybe I'm being too white pilled here, but I've often thought that there is an overconfidence in technology that I detect in the way that, again, it's kind of a form of utopianism. We can build this thing and add security to it. It's like, no, there's a fundamental law that you cannot build a system above a certain level of complexity and make it secure, because you've opened yourself up to attack. So, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess one of the other areas that I was thinking of here is like, again, getting back to the importance of extensibility, which maybe you would call adaptability. And political solutions need to be very adaptable to changing circumstances and not static. And of course, complexity gets in the way of that, which is why it's actually important to. You can think of complexity like entropy, I guess. Like you never want more entropy. Unless, I don't know, maybe you're doing some weird physics experiment or something. But entropy, in the general sense, is something like humans fight against incessantly, right? You're never trying to
Mm,
like create entropy um, in whatever thing you're trying to keep stable. Like maybe it's just your house or something. You don't want more entropy in your house. You want less. You want to maintain it as long as you can. So
mm.
that's why complexities like that, right? You never ever ever. I want to make this
Yes.
point very clear. Complexity is strictly bad, right? Complexity is never good from an engineering perspective. Again, okay, we can come up with some minute example, like complexity is good in like cryptography or something, right? But aside from special cases like that, in terms of systems design, in terms of getting functionality out of the system, complexity is always something to be resisted and reduced as much as possible. And that's how you actually get a better system that's more extensible and can adapt. And I guess another thing is we can't. I guess in terms of the technological obsession, we sort of get obsessed with like using things like machine learning to model things like extensively and try to predict the future. And we actually really can't do that. Like the future is always uncertain, and that's why extensibility is so important as well.
You've made me make a connection in my brain there that I feel stupid for not having done before. Um, if you think of information theory, entropy is directly related to complexity. It's kind of what you were saying there. So, for example, if you have a string of letters and the letters are A, that is a string that's very predictable, and therefore it has a low amount of information and a low amount of complexity in it.
Hmm.
And inevitably, what we have in society is order breaking down. There's been lots of discussion about this as a lens to analyze society, right? You've got order breaking apart, and the conservative impulse, which I think is correct, is to try to cling to order and prevent this kind of inevitable entropic process from happening. Well, when you increase complexity, as you just pointed out, you inevitably increase disorder, because complexity and entropy are definitionally hand in hand. Like if an increase in complexity is necessarily an entropic direction.
That's a fascinating insight that I hadn't even connected before.
Well, whatever you were saying made that connection in my head. So
Yeah, no, it makes sense
somehow
to
in
me.
the ether between us, we kind of arrived at that together. Okay, we're at an hour, and I just wanted to I wanted to finish with the question of what does Easter mean to you? Sorry for the sudden gear change, but I'm interested in just getting in an Easter related question for you.
Easter means go to church because the first time I went to church, I don't know, in like at least 10 years or something like that, was the week after Easter last year. So Easter
Huh.
this year just means get to the church and try harder at being a good Christian. So yeah, it'll be my first Easter mass in, I don't know, basically forever, probably literally my first Easter mass. So what Easter
Wow.
means to me is I'm trying. I'm
Yeah,
trying.
that's great. Amazing. Well, that's so good to hear, and I look forward to hearing how that goes. Is there any last comments that you wanted to make in any regard, or things you want to point people to in the stream?
Subscribe to my Substack and pay me. Charlemagne.substack.com. I've got. I was away checking out my new property
Hmm.
over the last week, so I've been slowed down a little, but I should have another post coming out in a few days on Ukrainian nationalism. Is the book I'm reviewing. I do like. I wouldn't call them book reviews exactly, but that's what you get if you pay. And then the post we kind of discussed basically on complexity that I'm going to publish on Substack will be paid as well. So that's where I'm doing a lot of stuff now. I haven't like retired on videos, but they take a while, and I do a lot of streams, and I'm quite busy now with moving. So the written format has been quite good, I think. So yeah, that's all I have to plug.
Thank you so much for this stream. That was absolutely fascinating. And now I'm going to finish by reading a little passage from the Gospels. Now Judas also, who betrayed him, knew the place, for Jesus ofttimes resorted thither with his disciples. Judas then, having received the band of soldiers and officers from the chief priests and the Pharisees, cometh thither with lanterns and torches and weapons. Jesus, therefore, knowing all the things that were coming upon him, went forth and saith unto them, Whom seek you? They answered him, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus saith unto them, I am he. And Judas also, who betrayed him, was standing with them. When therefore he saith unto them, I am he, they went backward and fell to the ground. Again therefore he asked them, Whom do you seek? And they said, Jesus of Nazareth. Jesus answered, I told you that I am he. If therefore ye seek me, let these go their way, that the word might be fulfilled which he spake. Of those whom thou hast given me, I lost not one. Simon Peter, therefore, having a sword, drew it, and struck the high priest's servant, and cut off his right ear. Now the servant's name was Malchus. Jesus therefore said unto Peter, Put up the sword into the sheath. The cup which the Father hath given me, shall I not drink it? So the band and the chief captain and the officer of the Jews seized Jesus and bound him.